Hello, my fellow writers. My name is Laura, and welcome back to Learn to Writer, the channel where we talk about the mental challenges of being a writer. Today we're going to be talking about one of the things that is the most terrifying for any writer, and that is talking to people about your writing. That's right. This can come up in any sort of different situation. It can either be a family event, a party, somewhere where you are expected to go and do small talk. And people will ask you what you do, and then you happen to mention writing, and then suddenly there's questions. I used to freak out about this a lot when I was younger. Like, I was never ashamed of the fact that I wrote, or, anything like that. So, I would say that, and then people would be like, here, follow-up question. And I'd be like, oh my God, what do I do, right? What I want to do is bring up a couple of the questions, like things that you can be aware that people would generally like to ask so that you can kind of have a prepared answer for it. And also some of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years about talking about your writing with people. And generally, this is going to be talking with people who are not writers themselves. So like I said, family, friends, people where you just, you get into the type of conversation where what do you do for a living? And they're like, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. And then they're like, what do you do for a living? And you're like, I'm writing a fantasy novel. That they are not a writer. I mean, they could be a writer as an orthopedic surgeon, but they're probably not a writer. You are in a conversation with somebody and they say, hey, what do you do? And you say, I'm a writer. Here's one of the follow-up questions that can happen. Oh, what do you write? Pretty simple question, but when you're not used to talking about your writing and, you're not super comfortable talking with other people, you're suddenly like, oh my God, what do I write? So what you want to do is be aware ahead of time of what it is that you write, or it doesn't even have to necessarily be what it is that you write so much as what it is you want to say that you write. Because I could answer that question with, what do you write? I write fantasy. I write fantasy that is set in secondary worlds, which means it is not going to be our world, it is going to be a world that I've completely made up. And sometimes I'll say that, because that more defines. Now, if you're more defining your answer like that, probably because you want follow-up questions, but you can basically say, I write fantasy, I write sci-fi, I write mystery, I write thriller, I write women's lit, whatever it is that you write, that can be your answer. Now, most people, because they are trying to small talk, will then be like, okay, what's your story about? This one gets a little bit more complicated because as writers, we are notoriously bad at knowing how to take the beautiful novel that we have created and or are creating and condense it down into a little pithy phrase or whatever. That's why I've gotten into the habit of, in my spare time or whatever, literally sitting down and being like, okay, how would I describe this? This is good for, these type of situations. It's also good if you ever happen to run into an editor or an agent or whatever, and they're like, oh, what do you write, right? You want to have some sort of an answer. So for right now, oh, what are you writing? I'm writing a story about a trans masked character in a magically created MMORPG. That's not all what the story is about. It's not very detailed. It's not whatever, but it is technically what my story is about. You can also go the route of it is X mixed with Y. I've never been very good at that. Some people are better at that than others. Let's see. If I had to pick an X, it's like X and Y. I guess .hack would be part of it. Yeah, I don't know. One of the other questions that always threw me for a loop is sometimes you'll say, oh, I'm a writer. And they'll be like, oh, have you published anything? There was part of me that always was felt bad because I hadn't published anything. That's not the point. You have to remember that the point of the conversation is they are just asking questions. So you say, no, I'm not published, but you can say, I've written this number of books, I've submitted to agents, haven't gotten picked up by agents, or you can just leave it at, no, I don't have anything published, because it basically means that they can't go out and buy your book. And that's mostly all what they're going to care about. Then there is, what are you working on? Kind of similar to what are you writing, but in that case you can either say, this is the topic of the novel that I'm working on, or you can be like, I'm working on a novel, I'm working on a fantasy novel, I'm halfway through. You can talk about the nitty gritty of it a little bit more, or you can talk about, what the book actually is. So for me, what are you working on? Right now I'm working on my third novel. I'm about halfway through and stuck at kind of stuck at the 3/4 mark, which happens a lot. And then they might follow that up with more questions and they might not. At that point, they might be built, what is the book about? And then, you go into that question. One of the questions I get that I actually really like is, where do you get your ideas? For a lot of writers, they don't really know, right? Like, the ideas just kind of come to us. But this is something that I sat down and, thought about because I really kind of was curious. I realized that other people don't look at the world the same way that I do, where, I'll look at a TV show and be like, oh, I want to do something like that. And then, you file it away in the back of your mind and then eventually you pull it out and you might put it in a story or make a story about that. Other people don't do that. They just watch it and they are entertained by the thing. Or if I see something weird like the dragon blood tree, that's in Africa where you cut it and then the blood comes out, or it's a sap, but it looks like blood. That's just an awesome concept to me. We get maple syrup out of trees and that's the sap. What are other saps that we could have out of trees that, then we could do magic potions with or stuff like that, right? That's just where my brain goes with that. And other people don't do that. They're like, that tree's kind of cool. Yeah, it does look like it's bleeding. And they move on. So one of the things that you can say when people are like, oh, where do you get your ideas from? You just be like, I get them from everywhere. You probably do. I just notice little details about my everyday world or about the media that I consume. And I just think about it a lot. And I mush it around in my head. And eventually it turns into a story. Obviously, your creative process might be a little different than that. But for the most part, if you just say, oh, I just get my ideas from everywhere, everything is an inspiration, you're not lying. You might not be going into as much detail as you could be, but it's still an answer. One of the other questions that you can get is, oh, can I read it? Obviously, this is entirely up to you. The polite turn down is, oh, it's definitely not ready for anybody to read yet, but I'll keep you in mind, fully with the intention of probably never keeping them in mind. If it is in a place where you think that people could read it, you can give it to them. I've found that for the most part, people don't really, you'll give it to them and they won't really ever read it. If you happen to give it to somebody and then they give you feedback on it, you're definitely going to want to take that feedback with a grain of salt, right? Because this is not somebody that you chose necessarily to read this. You have no idea what kind of feedback they gave you. They might have no idea how to read and critique something. Depending on how much direction you gave them, the feedback might not even be useful. So if you want to watch my video, how to get the feedback that you need, that kind of also talks about what happens when you get feedback that is not helpful. If it's kind of unsolicited, you're not the one going out and finding the people you want to give it to, it's kind of hit or miss about whether it's not going to be useful to you at all. But obviously, I'm not saying you can't just give it to random people to read. Maybe you'll find a new beta reader. You never know. Sometimes you will run into people who have well-meaning intentions, but really just don't have any idea what they're talking about when it comes to writing. Because remember, in general, you're talking to non-writers in this instance. So they'll be saying stuff like, oh, you should really write X, Y, and Z because it's popular right now. You should definitely write a Hunger Games type book or a Harry Potter type book because, those are selling right now. Well-meaning, but, I'm not saying you can't go do that, but you've probably already thought of that if that's what you're going to go do, right? Some people will be like, oh, I have an awesome idea for a book. Why don't you write it? Again, you can thank them for the idea. Ideas are cheap and easy, go write the book yourself. Don't say that to them. Oh, you're writing. Are you planning on becoming the next J.K. Rowling? No, you're not. You don't ever plan on that kind of success. I don't even want that kind of success, right? That's a little bit, that's too much for me. There's also the people who will be like, oh, you're writing. You're never going to make any money at that. Thank you for telling me. The response is, well, I'm mostly writing because I enjoy writing. That's why I have a day job. And then you can switch the conversation into your day job. One of the worst things that a person can say is, oh, you're still working on that. This is another one of those ones that would kind of send me into a tailspin. Because, they'd be like, oh, what story are you working on? And I tell them, I'm working on this. They're like, oh, you're still working on that. I'm like, as a writer, I understand that writing a book can take years. I mean, like, really. I don't think that most non-writers really understand how much time it takes to write a novel. It's kind of like they get stuff from TV, they get stuff from the news, where it's like this breakout hit. There's no discussion on, okay, that took this person 10 years to write this breakout hit. It's like, oh, it just popped fully formed from the ground and now they're amazingly popular. Or like you'll see it portrayed in movies or TV shows or anything like that where it's like, they're sitting there. Castle was notorious for this where like, that's just not how writers work. For the most part, it'll be the type of thing where it's like, oh, I'm stuck. I've got writer's block. I'm stuck. Suddenly I get it. And then suddenly I've got the whole draft and suddenly, my like I have a deadline and I didn't know what I was going to write. And then suddenly I have an idea and like I make my deadline. I feel like it's probably similar to when, doctors, they mention they're a doctor and then people are like, oh, I watched Grey's Anatomy or whatever, and like, you get an idea of how the medical profession works, but it's a TV show's version of how the profession works. Same thing with lawyers. Courtrooms are very boring. You never have the weird stuff like, in Legally Blonde where she's like, you had a perm and you came home and washed your hair, like that just doesn't happen, right? But, people see this stuff and they see it over and over again. And so like in their mind, that's how it works. And that kind of leads into, I want to say that the things that I have learned, that it's a really good idea to keep in mind, whenever you have to talk to a non-writer. First off, this is small talk. It doesn't have any indication of whether or not you're going to be a success or a failure as a writer or an author. You're just talking to a random person. Great practice for if you ever do talk to an agent or an editor and like they ask you what you're doing and all that kind of stuff. Most of the time you are not talking to anyone who has any control over whether you're going to be a success or a failure. So if you screw it up, okay, you move on. At the same time, like I said, most of these people are making small talk. I can't remember the number of times that I've made small talk with somebody and we've talked about like their profession or my profession or whatever. I don't remember it the next day, right? They might remember that you're a writer, like, or whatever, but they're not going to remember any of these details if you screw up. I guess this is really good advice for any small talk that you're making, is that most of the time small talk doesn't really turn into anything. It just is, and then it gets forgotten, right? It's to fill space. Most people that you talk to know little to nothing about what the writing industry actually is. And so when they say something, either you're like, that's not right at all, or you feel bad because you haven't done something, and it's like, but they have no idea what they're talking about. Most of the time, they've gotten their ideas from a TV show or what they've seen on the news, right? Like they don't know how much time and effort it takes to write a book. They don't know about all the steps it takes. They don't know about all the drafts it takes, all this kind of stuff, right? They just don't know. They'll say, oh, you should really be doing this. And you're like, oh my gosh, should I be doing this? And then you stop and you're like, no, that's not how it works. You know more than they do just by being in the industry and caring it all. Just remember that this is great practice. This is one of the reasons why I decided to start having like these answers in the back of my head, because then it comes up and then you can practice. You can figure out what's working and what's not. What are you working on? It's about a transmat character in an MMORPG that was magically created. I don't like that. I think it's a terrible elevator pitch for that book, but it's what I have right now. But I'm constantly working on improving that, right? Because unless you're really into reading books about MMORPGs, you probably don't care based on that. And so that's why you kind of want to, like, whatever your book is, you want to try out a whole bunch of things, see what interests people and all that kind of stuff, and just get used to talking about your writing. One day when you get published and people want to do interviews and all that kind of stuff, it's great practice. And then the last thing I do want to say is that small talk is hard, especially for the type of people who generally are creative, which is you're probably kind of introverted, kind of shy, and all that kind of stuff. I also have a video on here about how to practice reading in front of an audience, which is also a good way to just get used to a certain point, hearing your own voice is actually something like when I was working on learning how to read out loud better, like hearing my own voice was weird. It's just something you want to practice. You're not going to be good at it. You don't need to belittle yourself. If they have any of these questions, avoid talking about, oh, but it's not very good, or, oh yeah, no, you don't want to read it. It's not very good. Like my partner used to say, like back before I was building my own confidence, they used to say, don't tell me what I think about this book before I read it. Right? Let me make my own decisions about that. And I think that was very, very good advice. You don't need to belittle yourself, because that's basically what you're doing, is belittling yourself, right? You're making your accomplishments seem less good. Be proud of the things that you've done. The person you're talking to has never worked on a book as hard as you have, right? They do not have that skill at all, and you do. Be proud of what you've done, even if it isn't very much. Don't say, I haven't done very much. Be like, yes, I'm working on this story. I'm halfway through. You don't have to give a word count. Hopefully this gives you some stuff to think about for when a small talk opportunity comes up and you want to talk about your writing. Because obviously you can talk about your whatever your other day job is. You don't have to talk about writing. But I encourage you to get a little more comfortable talking about your writing so that it's not such a big deal when it does come up. And like I said, small talk opportunities are great for that because people probably aren't going to remember anyway. So if you like this video, go ahead and like this video. If you'd like to see whatever other videos I'm going to put out after this, go ahead and subscribe, or you can go back and watch some of the videos that I have put out, and I will see you in the next video. Okay, bye-bye.